Jesus was a storyteller, and we're going to look at this story that has been animated in a few moments. Before we do that, we're going to play a little word association game. So here's how this game is going to work. This is 2 thumbs up, and this is 2 thumbs down. Okay, let's practice. Everybody has to participate. 2 thumbs up, 2 thumbs down. We're going to keep doing it so everybody participates. 2 thumbs up, 2 thumbs down. Okay, I'm going to say a word, and you're going to give thumbs up or thumbs down. Simple rules, okay? You can't make your decision based on people around you. It has to be what you feel. We'll start with something easy. Dogs. Okay? A lot of dogs people. We're dogs people at my house. We have a dog. It's basically our fur baby. 2 thumbs up for dogs. What about the opposite? Cats. Oh. Mixed reviews on cats. Why do we have mixed reviews on cats and not dogs? Because cats do nothing. I'm just kidding. Okay, dogs, cats. How about this one? Roll Tide. A lot of thumbs up. I'll give everybody else the opportunity too. War Eagle. Okay. Those are easy ones. Okay. Let's do this. Politics. Mixed reviews on politics. Let's get more specific. Donald Trump. How about this, right? One day it's this, one day it's this. You guys know Donald Trump's been in the news a little bit recently, right? Okay, we'll do the opposite. Hillary Clinton. Got some mixed reviews on Hillary. Paying taxes. We can probably be anonymous on that one. Paying taxes. Let's do something a little more religious. I don't know if it's considered religious, but sometimes we associate things like this. Drinking beer. Got some of you refuse to vote on this. It's my pastor. What if he sees me with 2 thumbs up? How about church? We hope it would be 2 thumbs up. What about praying? Okay, serving. These seem to be easy ones. All right, let's take it to specific types of people. When I say this word, you, based on what your knowledge is or understanding, thumbs up or thumbs down. Pharisee. Most of us would go thumbs down, right, because of kind of what we associate. We saw the little video with a Pharisee. How about disciple? Most of us would think thumbs up. How about thief? Thumbs down. How about tither, giver? Most of us would think thumbs up. Adulterer. Sinner. Here's one. Christian. Most of us would think thumbs up, right? The point of this game is we tend to associate good or bad, thumbs up, thumbs down, with certain types of people or certain types of behavior. Now, the word Christian is an interesting one. Do thumbs up or thumbs down, because I think a lot of times in our circle, in church world, we tend to associate Christian with thumbs up, and maybe people outside of our circle, outside of the Christian faith, may often associate Christian with thumbs down. As a matter of fact, there was a book written a few years ago now that caused quite a stir in the evangelical Christian world called Unchristian. And the book was written by a guy named Gabe Lyons, and his team went out and did research on the word Christian and what people thought of the word Christian in our culture. And what he discovered, and then through a Barna research group kind of wrote a book about, was that people outside of the Christian faith tend to associate Christians with 5 characteristics: judgmental, hypocritical, anti-homosexual, uncaring, and sheltered, as they live sheltered lives. I don't think if you ask people inside the Christian faith to describe themselves, if those were the words that they would use. And so sometimes there's kind of this disassociation with what we believe are positive things about Christianity and those outside of the faith. There's kind of this us versus them mentality when it comes to even the word Christian itself. And the book Unchristian basically was a challenge to Christians that we have an image problem. Whether it's right or wrong, legit, not legit, because I don't think any of us would describe ourselves by those adjectives I gave, uncaring and judgmental and hypocritical and all those things. We wouldn't use those words to describe ourselves, but whether we believe that about ourselves or not, we've created an image that comes across that way. And so there's this constant association, good, bad. Now, here's the problem with that. The problem is that we didn't start out as Christians. This whole movement that we call the church, that we call Christianity, did not start out as Christians, that we were labeled Christians. It started with a group of people that were called disciples, that were called followers of Jesus. And what that meant for the disciples, for the followers of Jesus, what that meant is, one, obviously, they lived life with Jesus. For 3+ years, they lived life with Jesus. When Jesus called the 12, called his followers, they lived life with him. It wasn't, all right, let's have a Bible study and go home. They literally lived life with Jesus. They went from town to town with him. They lived in the area where he was. They listened to him teach. They saw him interact with people. They watched him heal. All these things. They literally lived life with Jesus. And then the second component of what it meant for these disciples is not only did they live life with Jesus, but they obeyed what Jesus said. Even when Jesus gave them crazy commands. I mean, think about Peter out fishing, right? This lifelong professional fisherman. And when Jesus called him, he stands on the bank after they have fished all night and caught no fishes, as the little kid song used to say. When they'd fished all night and caught no fishes, Jesus cries from the bank, "Cast your nets on the other side." Now, we've read enough about Peter in the New Testament to know that he probably cursed on the inside, if not on the outside, and said, "What does this guy know?" Threw his nets on the other side, crazy command, and his net was full of fishes. And he began, and then Jesus said, "Follow me." And so even when Jesus said crazy stuff, what seemed to be crazy things, they obeyed him. They followed him. So they lived life with Jesus, and they obeyed what Jesus said. And so what came out of that is people began to say they're living in the way of Jesus. That it wasn't just about a set of beliefs, but it was a life that was marked by following Jesus. It was marked by Jesus. And so this went on for 3 years. The disciples followed him, and then 3 years later, Jesus died. He was raised back to life from the Father, by the Father. He ascends back to heaven, and he tells his disciples what? You continue what I started. You keep it going. When we read what we call the Great Commission at the end of the Gospels, Jesus says to them, go make what? Disciples. Did he say go make converts? Did he say convert people to a certain set of beliefs? Now, beliefs are an inherent part. We have to believe who Jesus is and what he said and he died and those things. But what Jesus said is, I want you to go make disciples. I want you to go continually make followers. I want you to create people who follow me, who live like Jesus. And that's how it started. We read the book of Acts, particularly those first few chapters, and we read about people who were devoted to one another, and they were following the example and the teachings of Jesus. And so when you go and read the first part of Acts, you see that they were living life like Jesus, and they were living among the marginalized of culture, just like Jesus was. They lived life like Jesus. And so that's why followers began to be called the Way. They weren't called Christians early on. They were called followers of the Way. Why? Because they were living out the way of life that Jesus lived. They were living out a way of life that Jesus demonstrated. And it's not until we get to Acts chapter 11 that they are called Christians for the very first time by those that were watching them. And so these people that were watching this group of Jesus followers, they began to label them. They began to call them Christians. And if you go back to the original language, the word Christian actually means little Christ, little Jesuses. And so they saw this group and they say they act, behave, teach exactly how Jesus did. It's almost like they're a little Jesus. A little Jesus. Now, if you're a parent that has a child that's like you kind of get that, right? You kind of get like that's a little Devin. Zach doesn't like me to tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. There's a guy that was an older guy that was living in our community back when we lived a little closer into Decatur in another part of Trinity. There's a guy that came over to work on my mower. I was having mower problems, and I'm mechanically challenged. And so he came over to help out. He's an older guy in the community. He was like, wears overalls, has a big farm, garden, just a really nice, older Southern gentleman. And he and I had a number of conversations, but he had never met my children. He had heard me talk about my kids and talk about my son, Zach. And so Zach happened to be there when he came over this time to help me on my mower. And so I called Zach out of the house, and I said, I want you to come out and meet Mr. Jimmy. And so Zach comes out, and he meets Mr. Jimmy, and Mr. Jimmy, in his old Southern gentleman ways, looks at Zach, and he said, Devin, I have to tell you, he couldn't be more like you if someone had chipped him off of your butt. Like, that's a phrase I had never heard before in my life, like, chipped him off of your butt. So the girls affectionately began to call Zach Butt Chip for about the next 4 weeks until we had to shut that down. A little Devin, right? And so the culture began to call Christians little Jesuses. Now, I think that Luke had a prejudice. Luke wrote the book of Luke and Acts, as we've learned in this series. I think Luke had a prejudice against the term Christian. As a matter of fact, he only uses it one time. He uses it in Acts chapter 11 when he's describing how the people labeled Jesus followers, and then he goes right back to calling them followers of the way. He prefers the way. And here's the point. The point is, being a follower of Jesus meant being marked by a way of life. They lived like Jesus lived. There's this group of people that had a ferocious love for Jesus, and they had a ferocious love for each other, and they had a ferocious love for others. And oftentimes, the way they lived life was countercultural. It was against the people that were around them. It was different. And here's a phenomenal idea for the book of Acts. Following Jesus looked a lot like Jesus. Wow. Isn't that an overwhelming thought? They were called Christians because for them, being a disciple, being a follower, meant they looked a lot like Jesus. And that's why they picked up the label Christian. Little Christ. And that's what this series has been about. And that's what we want our church to be about. That when people see us, that they see those people act like what we think Jesus would act like. Now, we have about 4 weeks left in this series. And to be honest with you, I could go 100 possible directions with this series between now and when it ends. But my goal over the next few weeks is just to hit a couple of very relevant stories, and then we're going to wrap this thing up the first weekend of September. And then we're starting a brand new series. Who clapped? We're starting a new series that's going to be even longer. I'm just kidding. We're starting a new series on September the 13th called Core, C-O-R-E. Now, this is an important series in the life of our church, so I really want you to be here. I want you to be here between now and then. Starting September 13th, a series called Core, and we're really going to break down what does it mean to be a church based on everything we've learned in the Continue series. Now, what does it mean? What is the core of what we are supposed to be about? And this series, I believe, will help shape our future as a group of Jesus followers in this city, doing ministry for this city. And so it's important for you to be here, because my ultimate desire, the desire of the heart of Ashley and I, is that we want to be a people who are on mission, a people who are on mission to continue what Jesus began. It's really that simple for me. That our mission as a church, that our vision as a church is to continue what Jesus started. To continue what He began. And we want that to be the lens by which we do everything. The lens by which we serve, the lens by which we do ministry to kids, the lens by which we do ministry in our community, the lens by which we worship as a group of Jesus followers, the lens by which we give, the lens by which we live life. We want everything to go through the lens of, we want to continue what Jesus started. I want to live life in a gospel-centered, Jesus-focused way. All of my life, not just when I show up on Sunday, but I learn to live life in a gospel-centered, Jesus-focused way. Now, let me tell you why this emphasis, I believe, is so important, particularly in the culture that we live in. Kind of this Bible Belt, culture in the South. Let me tell you why this is so important. Here's why. Because people often in our culture consider themselves Christians because they made some type of external profession of faith, but there has been no internal transformation. And they don't have a true desire to actually follow Jesus, as we read about in the New Testament. Maybe, and this is real for me. This is the world in which I was raised. This is the world in which we're doing ministry. There's so many people that they went to camp, or they showed up at VBS, or they went to some cheesy youth event where some dude stood up and acted like he was standing before the judgment seat of God, and then two guys came out and dragged him out, and he was screaming, "I don't want to go to hell." And then right before he got dragged out of the door, he turned around to the other guys in the skit and said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Like, have you ever been a part of one of those? And then somebody came out and said, "How many of you don't want to go to hell? Put your hand up." And everybody in the room put their hand up, and he said, "All right, say these 10 magical words, and it's going to keep you out of hell." And a lot of people were persuaded that they were in. They got baptized, and they were persuaded that they were in because they didn't want to die and go to hell, or because they didn't want to go somewhere their family was not going. And we kind of live in this culture that's been dominated by that type of Christianities. Say these magical words, put your hand in the air, get baptized, check the box you're in. And they grow up saying, "Yes, I'm a Christian because I do this, or I don't do this, and I show up occasionally to church, and I try to do the right thing, and I try to be morally good." And oftentimes, whether we say it out loud or not, our mindset is, well, at least I'm better than that person. At least I don't do that. And here's my list of why I'm a Christian and why I'm acceptable before God. And then we read the story of Jesus, and he rips that mindset to shreds. And he destroys that framework that so many of us grew up in. And he aggressively goes after our hearts. And he aggressively goes after our lives. And what I love about the Gospels is that Jesus tackles this idea directly, which brings us to Luke chapter 18, which is our text today. So go to Luke chapter 18. We're going to read this parable that we saw animated at the beginning, and then we're going to kind of bring this together with the Continue series. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. He, and this is Jesus, also told this parable. Now look at this phrase here. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. I love that Jesus deals with this directly. He goes right after them. Jesus doesn't pull a group over to the side and say, "Hey, don't do it like these people are doing it." Jesus goes straight after them. He goes straight for their heart, just like he does for us. He goes straight after them. He goes straight after them. He talks to them and not about them. Jesus doesn't cloak this in the form of a prayer request. Hey, pray for such and such person. Now let me tell you why you should pray for them, and really it's just gossip from that point on. Jesus goes straight after them, doesn't he? He goes to them, and what he says to us is there are people who are trusting in themselves, and they were treating others as a result of that with contempt. And we're quick to say, "That's not me." But wait. Let's read the rest of the story. Verse 10. Here's the story. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, hiss, and one was a tax collector. So get the picture. There's a Pharisee, and again, that raises negative feelings and connotations in our mind because we've read the gospel and we've heard all these sermons about Jesus coming down on the Pharisees and how hypocritical they were. And so immediately we raise red flags when we hear the word Pharisee. But let me kind of break it down for you. A Pharisee was actually an extremely religious person. And they were very educated, and they were very respected in the community. They were not despised in the community. They were looked at as spiritual leaders. Very religious, very knowledgeable. They were leaders in the community. And we hear the word Pharisees, and we immediately judge them. And we say, "Well, that's not me. I'm not a Pharisee. I'm not religious. I got a relationship," right? We love those type of cliches. And we immediately hiss. And so we have this Pharisee who's actually a very religious person. And then the other person in our story is a tax collector. And I've mentioned this before, and we'll jump into it again next week because we're going to talk about Zacchaeus. But the tax collector, they were wicked traders. They were wicked traders. Very sinful, wicked traders. They basically sold their soul to the Roman Empire, who in return pillaged their own people. And so they were basically selling out to ISIS, and then ISIS was coming in pillaging the people that they betrayed. Like, that's the level of tax collectors. And so both of these people go into the temple to pray. This religious elite Pharisee and this tax collector. Jesus creates an extreme contrast here between super religious and super pagan in our minds. And so Jesus sets up the story. They both go into the temple to pray. Verse 11. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. Listen to his prayer. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Now, the Pharisee gets the bad rap. As soon as we read this, we think, oh, that guy was so prideful, and, who does he think he is, and looking down on other people. But when you break down his prayer, look, it's actually a pretty God-centered prayer. He doesn't say, God, look how great I am, not thank me. He's actually thanking God. He acknowledges that God has delivered him from sin's progression. Like, we do the same thing. Like, he acknowledges, God, thank you that you have kept me safe from committing this sin or falling down this path, or falling into this sinful trap. And I want to tell you, it's not bad to pray for deliverance from certain sins. It's not bad to pray, God, protect me from this sinful path. Or to have someone in your life that commits a certain sin and saying, God, please protect me from that. Don't let me do that harm to my family or commit that sin in my life. And it's not bad to pray for those things. As a matter of fact, when I read this guy, I understand, he takes holiness seriously. Doesn't he? He's not taking it for granted. He takes a holy life serious. Now, I know we say, but Devin, he said, I don't want to be like that guy. What about that phrase? We all do this. We all do this. And we all kind of have this mindset, well, at least I'm not where he or she is. Or at least I don't do what my cousin does. Or at least I don't behave like my neighbor. Or at least I don't commit the sin of my uncle. We all do this, and we do it at such different levels. This past week, I had to drop Reagan off for a band camp practice. She's a dancer, and so she's in part of the band camp. And I had an hour to waste with Zach before he went to register for classes. And so I took him to McDonald's for breakfast, which is the healthiest place on earth to go. And so we go to McDonald's, and there's this family that comes in, and they had a little girl with them, and the little girl ordered something from the cash register. And I could hear this, and then she went over and sat down with her parents, and I could hear this scrambling going on behind me. And I suddenly realized they were coming down on her, out loud, publicly coming down on her, too loud. And they were coming down on her because of what she had ordered. I don't know if they thought it was too much money or she didn't need to eat that or what. But the mom got up and marched up to the counter and pulled the receipt out and was like, I told you that you ordered a number 7 and you shouldn't have gotten a number 7, and that thing costs $5 and you're never going to be able to eat that. And then, of course, the little girl gets upset, and then the dad starts coming down on her don't get mad at me. You caused all this, and it's your fault. And to the point, as a parent, I wanted to be dude, here's $5. Let off the little girl. If I need to pay for the $5 meal, here's $5. Just don't humiliate your daughter in public. And immediately, my reaction was, I'm not the best parent in the world, but at least I'm not like that. We do this all the time, don't we? And so here's this Pharisee, at least I'm not like him. And we can do this even in a positive attitude. Let me give you an example of that. You've heard me say before, my father, who's been with us and will be with us in the future at times, is a first-generation Christian. And so he comes from a long history of Hudson men that were not good people. They were extreme alcoholics, and involved in some gruesome things and imprisoned and murders and just a long history of violence and extreme alcoholism. And then my dad became a Christian. And so when I look back on my family heritage, there's this spirit that I have, like, God, thank you that you saved me from the heritage that went before me. A bad prayer to pray, is it? Like, God, thank you that it stopped with my father and that you made a difference in our lives. So, like, that's not a bad attitude to have. Like, God, thank you for bringing us out of that. That's a positive attitude. And so I kind of get where the Pharisee's going with this. God, thank you that you have saved me from X, Y, and Z. And thank you that you have protected me from a life that is defined by these things. Now, and then he goes to the next level. Look at verse 12. I fast, the same Pharisee talking, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. Like, he goes to the next level with his religious activities. And what he says, let's just be honest, he one-ups most of us. Now, if we were to break this down into modern terms, what he would be saying is, God, I'm always at church, and I don't drink, and I don't watch R-rated movies unless they're about Jesus, and I don't listen to secular music, whatever labels we put on it. Like, that would kind of be our list. But look at his list. Like, he says, I fast twice a week. Now, let's be honest. Like, fasting's not a wildly popular concept, is it? Like, fasting, the idea of, hey, I'm going to forget food for a while because there's something better than that, and that's seeking God. Like, that's not a wildly popular concept among us. And so he says, I fast twice a week. And then he goes to the next level. I tithe on everything. I tithe on everything. He's not having like the net gross conversation in his mind, like, should I tithe on the net or the gross? He tithes on everything. He tithes when the guy hands him the $10 to borrow, $1 that's going into the offering. He tithes on borrowed money. He tithes on gifts. He tithes on tax returns. Like, there's nothing inherently wrong with what this guy's doing. And we think, well, he was a rules keeper. But in reality, there's nothing actually wrong with rules in the right context, right? Like, we have rules in my family. It's not a bad thing to have rules. When the kids go back to school this week, they're going to have rules that they have to abide by to maintain some level of peace amidst the chaos of life. And so rules are inherently a bad thing. And so this guy's like, look, I'm fasting twice a week. I'm giving on everything that's given to me. What does that tell us about him? It tells us that he's serious about God. His obedience to God, his love for God, he's serious about holiness. If this guy were alive today, he'd be leading a Bible study. He'd be serving, giving. He would probably be up for a staff position at a local church. He probably raised his hands in worship. This guy would be a model Christian. And there's nothing in the text that indicates otherwise. Let's go to 13. Listen to the prayer of the tax collector. And you're going to see why everything I just said is so dangerous in a moment. But the tax collector, so there's a contrast here, the little conjunction but. On the other hand, the tax collector standing far off would not even lift his eyes to heaven, but he beat his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. So the tax collector's prayer is significantly shorter. Nothing religious about it. Nothing moral about it. Pure brokenness. Now think about these two guys. Is the Pharisee perfect? Oh, he knows he's not perfect. Is the tax collector the worst guy on the planet? No, because he's at the temple, right? He could have pointed his finger at, well, such and such is not even here, right? So he's not the best guy, and they're not the worst guy. But look at his brokenness. Now, when you kind of begin to understand brokenness, you understand there's a couple of different levels of it. There's kind of the blame brokenness, like, I did this, but it's really someone else's fault. Like, God, if you hadn't given me that wife or that husband, or if I didn't have that boss, or if I didn't work this job, or if I hadn't been placed around that circle of friends, or if that temptation hadn't have come my way. Like there's kind of blame brokenness, and then there's pure, unadulterated brokenness like we see in this text. You ever been at that place in your life? You ever been in a place in your life where the only thing you can do is cry out for mercy and grace and healing? Like, those of you that know my story, you know, like, I've been through a full gamut of emotions and brokenness. And there was many times when there was sin in my life that I had a blame game brokenness. And I remember that there were strategic times in my healing and redemption process where there was complete and utter brokenness, where I realized it was no one's fault and no one's sin but mine. That the only thing I could do in that moment was to plead for God to forgive and heal me. There was no one to blame. Completely broken. Now, I don't want to chase this rabbit, but it's something that we need to hear often. I don't think you can really understand your need for God until you see the depth of your sin. And I don't think you can fully see the depth of your sin until you see how gracious and good God is. And when you begin to understand Him and His grace and His mercy, you begin to understand how sinful you are. And here we see this tax collector in pure brokenness. Now, 14 is one of the most meaningful but also eye-opening statements in Luke's gospel to me. Look what Jesus says. I tell you, this man, which man? The broken tax collector. This man went down to his house justified. Let me stop there for just a moment. This man went down to his house justified. This is, again, one of the most meaningful statements in the Bible. He went home justified. That is grace. That's God reaching down to the undeserving and bestowing upon them complete, unmerited mercy. And that word justified is kind of a theological word that we like to throw around. What it really means is being in right standing with God. He's been made right with God. So understand the depth of this statement. This tax collector, with all of his baggage and all of his history and all of his sin, and as bad as he was in everyone's book, he beats on his chest and he says, God, the only thing I have to plead in this moment is for your mercy and your grace. Would you forgive me? And in that moment, this deplorable sinner is made right with a holy God. A completely, utterly holy God forgives this sinner. There's a phrase that, again, you read in a lot of theology books, a lot of guys write about. It's called imputed righteousness. And the idea of imputed righteousness is that I am made right with God through someone else. That it's not anything in me that causes me to be right with God, but it has been imputed upon me, has been given to me. That the righteousness that I have is someone else's righteousness. It's a standing that's not mine. It's given to me. Now, bear with me just a moment, because this is important. Don't get lost in what I'm about to say here. The verb that's used here is unlike anything we have in English. And I want to tell you what it is, just because I want you to understand the significance. It is a perfect passive participle verb. Now, that means nothing to you, and it doesn't really mean a lot to me, other than here's what it means. Those three things, perfect, passive, participle, when you put all those three things together, you know what that means in the original language? It means that this is 100% an act of God and no one else. That God alone reached down and justified this sinner. That he was acted upon by God. That God provides the righteousness. That God provides the justification. That God provides the forgiveness. That there is nothing in this tax collector that deserves God's righteousness. That there's nothing about him that makes him worthy of being made acceptable before God. That there's nothing about this guy that makes him worthy of God's grace. But God, in His infinite grace and mercy, reaches down and bestows His righteousness upon this sinner. And that, my friend, is grace. Undeserving, unmerited, unearned, undeserved grace. What a beautiful picture. Now, in this moment, we could all raise our hands and worship and sing Amazing Grace and go home. But then, in this verse, there's a comma. And this comma is one of the most significant commas in the entire New Testament. Read it again. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, comma, rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Rather than the other. And this comma makes those next four words some of the most terrifying words in Luke's gospel. And it caused a firestorm among Jesus' hearers. Because when Jesus tells this story, he says, one person went home right with God. And it's not who you think it ought to be. Rather than the other. One justified, one not. Why is this so frightening? This is so frightening because our churches are filled with people who measure their standing before God based on their own behavior and based on their own morals, and they're trusting in themselves. I heard a comic recently say that his biggest fear was to die and be standing in line before the pearly gate and to find himself behind Mother Teresa, and for St. Peter to look at Mother Teresa and say, while he's standing behind her listening, I'm sorry, you didn't quite make it. Like that was his biggest fear, right? Like, you're behind Mother Teresa, like she didn't get in, so like, what's your hope? But we live with that mindset, don't we? Do I measure up? Have I done enough? Am I good enough? Now, if you grew up in church like I did back in the 80s and 90s, I'm going to end this message in an unusual way. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was this evangelism program that came out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. There was a pastor that led that church for decades and really was a face of the Christian movement back in the 80s and 90s, a guy named D. James Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy created this program that was called Evangelism Explosion. Has anyone ever heard of this? Okay, so everybody that's a church person in the 80s is giving yourself away right now. Evangelism Explosion. And the idea behind Evangelism Explosion is that was back in the day, like churches would just like go out and knock doors and bam, bam, bam to a stranger. Like you can't even get a stranger to come to the door anymore. But back then, that was like a method that people used to do evangelism. And so you would knock on the door, you would be in a conversation with someone, and the first question to kind of engage this person with the gospel was this question. If you died today and stood before God, and He said to you, why should I let you into my heaven? How would you respond? Like that was the question that you would ask to kind of get the spiritual conversation going. Now, I want to discourage you today from beginning any conversation in our culture to someone else with the phrase, if you died today, okay? That's probably not a phrase you want to choose to use unless you have a relationship with the person that you're talking to. Like if you say that to a stranger today, there's a whole different context in the culture that we live in, right? But the point behind the program was really good, and it was very effective back in his day. But the question, if you died today and stood before God, and He said to you, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? In our story, the Pharisee says to God, you should let me into your heaven because I'm not an adulterer. And I'm not an extortioner. And I'm not a thief. And I'm faithful to my family. And I go to church. And I fast. And I pray. And I give. And I serve. And I lead a Bible study. And I'm on the leadership team at my church. And the list goes on and on and on. And a modern American stands before Jesus and says, you should let me into heaven because I do my best. And I am a good person. and I don't harm people. And the list goes on and on and on. And the Pharisee, like so many people in the church today, believed that his acts, his behavior, his acts of spiritual growth, reading his Bible, praying, fasting, giving, serving, his acts of spiritual growth made him right with God. And God looks at him and says, not justified. See how frightening this story is? The tax collector, on the other hand, stands before God, and God says to him, why should I let you into my heaven? And the tax collector in our story says, God, I shouldn't be let in. I'm a sinner. I'm undeserving of your mercy and grace. It is only by you that I can enter. It is only by your mercy. It is only by your grace. It is only through Jesus. I plead Jesus. And God says to him, justified. Our only hope today is Jesus. There's no amount of religious activity or behavior modification that will make you acceptable before God. Our mantra, our theme, what you will hear us say over and over and over and over again, particularly in a culture where so many people are depending upon, I'm good enough, I don't do this, I behave this way, I don't do these things, I do these things, I'm better than that. Our mantra has to be Christ and Christ alone. You see, here's the risk. We all come to Jesus with baggage. Some of us have pagan baggage, right? I lived this life, I was addicted to this, I behaved this way, I slept with this person, I did these things. And we have our long list of sins that we come to Jesus with that baggage. On the other hand, people come to Jesus with a list of religious baggage. I did these things, I went to church, I behaved in this way. We all come to Jesus with baggage. And we fall in this state of brokenness and repentance and say, I can't make it on my own. I need what Jesus has done to redeem me. And Christ sets us free. And as we begin to walk in and rejoice in our freedom from those things, and as we begin to walk in freedom and pursue holiness as we should as Jesus followers, if we're not careful, we suddenly don't need Jesus any longer. Because I do this and I behave this way and I don't do these things and I'm better than that person and I go to church and I give and I serve and I'm in a small group, and suddenly we don't need Jesus. And our spiritual victories become about us and we start looking down on others. And we become as prideful as the Pharisee. And we lose sight of our sin. And we lose sight of our need for the gospel. And we begin to trust in what I call acts of horizontal righteousness. Not about what I do for God or what God's doing in me, but what I'm doing horizontally. My righteousness, how I'm behaving, how I'm acting, how I'm better than those around me. And we start trusting in our righteousness and we lose sight of our need for the gospel of Jesus Christ every single day of life. The theologian John Calvin said it this way. Listen to these words carefully. Every man that is puffed up with self-confidence. Listen. Every person that is puffed up with self-confidence. I can do it. It's about me. Self-confidence. Every person that is puffed up with self-confidence carries an open war with God. When I'm resting in my own self-confidence, I'm in an open war with God, to whom we cannot be reconciled in any other way than by denying ourselves. Jesus says that right around this story. If you want to come to me, deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. So Calvin says we cannot become reconciled in any other way than by denial of ourselves. That is, by laying aside all confidence in our own virtue and our own righteousness and relying on His mercy alone. Let me illustrate it and we're done. Let's say that you and I were both diagnosed with whatever we want to use here. Let's say arthritis. And so you and I are both diagnosed with arthritis, and we come back together after about 30 days, and I say to you, my arthritis has been completely healed. I no longer have arthritis. And you say to me, Devin, what did you do to get rid of this arthritis? And I say to you, and Dr. Beach will know how absurd this is, and I say to you, I drank Pepto-Bismol for 30 straight days, and I no longer have arthritis. So what's your response going to be? Where's CVS? I've got to go buy some Pepto-Bismol. And I let you begin to go away, and just before you're out of my voice's reach, I say to you, but guess what? I also took Excedrin 5 times a day during those 30 days. And you would ask yourself, what really cured him? Was it the Pepto-Bismol, or was it the Excedrin? See where I'm going with this? We are made right with God and kept right with God through Jesus alone. Not Jesus plus anything. Not Jesus plus how good you are. Not Jesus plus what you don't do. Not Jesus plus whatever you want to rattle off of acts of righteousness and spiritual growth in your life. And again, those are positive things. Don't hear me say you shouldn't do those things. But it is not Jesus plus anything. It is Jesus and Jesus alone who is our cure. It is not our good behavior. It is not our acts of righteousness. It is Jesus and Jesus alone. He is the foundation of our faith, and He is the foundation of our life after our faith. And we rest in Him alone, lest we stand like the Pharisee and say, Jesus, I'm a good person because I did all these things and I don't do these things and I'm better than that person. And God says to us, you've missed it. Not justified. And we keep a spirit of the tax collector. I plead Jesus and Jesus alone. This week, we, in the life of our church, in the last few weeks, I should say, even though where we're at right now, we're a little smaller and life is happening and we kind of hear about everything that's going on. And in the life of our church in the last few weeks, we have had births, babies that were born into the world. We have a baby that's about to be born into the world. And we have people who have died in their family. So yesterday, Ashley and I went to a funeral, and we saw a guy who has passed from death to life, who is Rick's father in our church. And the pastor knew him and talked on and on and on about how much he knew Jesus, and they had stopped breathing here and started breathing there. What an incredible idea that is. And so we have this full spectrum of life and death. And Ashley and I have a friend that lives in the community that he used to come see her all the time when she was doing insurance. And anybody that was a male 65 and over loved Ashley for whatever reason. I lived in Decatur, so they would constantly come in her office, and she kind of developed this friendship with this guy. He's probably around the 70s, and the last couple of months his health has just deteriorated, and he's lost tons of weight, and he's literally on his deathbed. And so we stopped to see him just to make sure his heart was okay and to talk to him and to, in some ways, kind of say goodbye, knowing it might be our last time to see him. And so I saw that, and a man that's on the verge of death. We saw a man who's just died, that's passed from life to death, but really into life. And we have seen new life being born. And I have thought in that moment that it doesn't matter if it's new life coming into the world or it's leaving this world, that from there to there and everything in between, it's all about Jesus. It's about Him. That when we bring new life into the world, that's our calling to point that new life and to bring that life up, saying to them, it's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Because there's going to come a time when every new life reaches the end of life. And we're going to stand before God. And the only thing we're going to have to plead is not how good we are, or great we are, or better we are. All we have to plead is Jesus. That's our mantra. Jesus and Jesus alone. And that's what you're going to hear taught and preached from this stage as long as I have breath to breathe. It is Jesus and Jesus alone. That's it. He is our life. He is our hope. He is our righteousness. And we plead Him. Let's bow our heads for prayer. God, this story is one that is overwhelming. The reality of a man that could stand, that has done so many things of righteousness, and yet God says to him, not justified. And God, a fear that I have among people that profess to be Christians in our churches today is we are easy to create this list of things we do and don't do, and to make us feel better than such and such, or we don't behave this way. And soon, we're resting in us, and our own self-confidence, and our own hope, and our own self-righteousness. God, help us to have the spirit of the tax collector that comes to you and says, there's nothing to the table I bring. It is only Jesus and Jesus alone. It is His righteousness. I rest in who He is. And so, God, I pray today that through this message, I know that there are people under the sound of my voice today that they have trusted in the wrong thing. And that may be a good thing. It may be a prayer that they prayed when they were in camp, or a story that they heard in VBS and they raised their hand along it. And God, you know I'm not trying to cast doubt on people's salvation, but you call us to examine our hearts to say, Jesus goes right after our hearts to say, what are you trusting in? What are you trusting in? Is it about you, or is it about Jesus? With our heads bowed and eyes closed today, this is not an easy type message to teach, because I know that there are those of you that are listening to me today that you think about that moment where you came to faith in Christ and you began to question, was it legit? What am I trusting in? And to be honest with you, I want you to have that conversation. Because I want you to make sure that when you stand before God, you're trusting in one thing alone. And so, right before we end today, with our heads bowed and eyes closed, there's some of you that you need to have that conversation with God to say, there's nothing I'm bringing that makes me acceptable to you. I trust in Jesus and Jesus alone. Would you have that talk with Him? Would you just say, God, I am a sinner in need of a Savior. I trust in Jesus and Jesus alone for my life, for my righteousness. I want our heads bowed and eyes closed. You say, Devin, would you pray for me? Because God's spoken to my life today and I am unsure, or I prayed that prayer, and I just want you to pray for me today that I'll understand this and I will live in this theme, this idea of Jesus and Jesus alone. And so I wonder if there's someone out there that you've prayed that prayer, or you're struggling with this and you just need prayer today. Would you just raise your hand, or I, as your pastor, can pray for you today? Just hold it up, just me and you. Okay? Awesome. God, we rest in Jesus and Jesus alone. Jesus paid it all. It's all to Him we owe. We rest in who He is today. We plead Jesus. In your name we do pray. Amen.